There's one black man, it's really interesting. He must be about, I know he's over 7. I'd say he's probably close to 8 feet. A great big husky black man. And he's had a wife, well, she died last year, but he had a wife that was in a nursing home. When I first started down, well, I'd say about 10 years ago, he would come in and he'd say, I have one of my grandchildren with his wife was in a nursing home, and his grandchildren lived in Detroit. The one grandchild, but was so light that I knew that he must have been, his wife maybe was white. See, I didn't know, but I knew there had to be some because we have a lot of light-skinned ones. Anyway, he brought one grandchild that was from Toledo, one grandchild that lived in town, but he didn't make sure that we knew him, Rose and me. So as soon as we get there, you'd laugh. Every week he sees us coming. And you got to put your arm in his arm to get you down the chair, the skirts and everything. Well, about 2 years ago, he told me his wife had died, and I said, I didn't know. And he had the obituary all typed out with her name, and where they had 2 services. They had a service at this Methodist church, but I don't think it goes to church there. But the preacher there, they had a service. Then they had a church service for her in Toledo, because one of his daughters or someone lives in Toledo. But anyway, he keeps me posted on his grandchildren. Okay. He's very much of a gentleman, but he likes wants to make sure that we know he's there and everything.
Yeah.
The Simpson family. Well, I told him about my grandpa.
Yeah.
And I knew I'd met my grandma. I didn't meet my grandma on my mother's side. She died. Okay, my grandpa, I knew him until he died. He lived with his 2 sisters and his 1 son. They lived on this huge, big farm, the one that had the Surrey, and had cattle and everything. And my aunts, it was really funny. My Uncle Bert, Herbert Bert, he was great for going out and getting all kinds of berries, and bringing them in for my aunts to can everything. That time you didn't have freezers. And he would keep bringing them in. They'd work. Sometimes what they'd do, I knew, they told my dad, because he was the youngest in the family. We were over there, they had some Bert's out looking, and as soon as he starts out again, they'd throw him out. Because when they first opened the big dam right down in their yard, they had a place where you kept cold things because the water was real cold. Yeah. You could get down there, and the water was cold. That's where they kept their butter and lots of things. But anyway, they both were teachers. And they both taught close to where they lived, except at one time, one aunt taught in Akron, Ohio. And then she taught in New Philly, but then they went home, been back home, and lived with their dad and Uncle Bert. Uncle Bert had been a telegrapher on the railroad, I guess. And then he came back to the farm too, so they all lived together. And like this farm this big dam where they lived, they were allowed to live there. It was a government dam. They had them all over Harrison County. They have Piedmont Dam, Clendenning's the one that they lived on. There's a great big Y camp on Clendenning. We went there, our family. I loved to visit their house. They always had so much food that when you'd go in the house, the first place I'd go as a kid, I'd get in the cupboard to see what they'd baked. Open these big cupboards and see what they'd baked. And then if they were gone someplace, my dad always knew how to get in the house. Well, fishermen would come there and camp in their front yard. And they had an old school clock, and someone stole that one time. And then they had an old Victrola. I still have the records. Uncle Bert, when they died, I got all these old records. They had an old Victrola, someone stole that. They've taken it out of their house, they didn't know, and the school clock. But I have a bunch of these records. For some reason, Mother got them. I don't remember how I got them, but I have them. Anyway, they were quite interesting, the 2 sisters. My dad started teaching when he was about like 19 years old. And I have a picture of him with all these kids in one school. It was really interesting to look how all these kids in this little school called Tippecanoe, how they were dressed. And he, of course, was standing up there. He was tall and everything. And that was his class. Well, then both of their sisters went to be teachers. They would go to normal schools, they thought, and take tests to become teachers. So they taught in country schools, out in the country. And that one I think was interesting. I went with my dad 2 or 3 times when he visited schools. By being the county superintendent, he visited all these schools. So I went with him, and I learned to drive when I was about 15 years old, and my dad had let me drive anywhere. And we'd get over to Aunt Laura's and Aunt Pearl's, and they'd find out that my dad let me drive, and they'd say, "Den, you could have both been killed." But, getting the ruts and everything, but my dad never worried about it. He always let me drive. I think I got my driver's license when I was about 16. I only had my one uncle, my one aunt's husband was the mayor of this little town of Caddis. Well, the highway patrol would come there, and when the highway patrol, Uncle Charlie said, "Well, you can come and take your test." So I went with a highway patrolman to take my exam to be a teacher, to be a driver. Had it ever since. Never had an accident.
Never had an accident. Wow.
Drove
Got
all
any
those
tickets
years.
either, for that matter.
What?
Don't ever have any tickets either.
No?
Wow.
She's not a speed demon.
Okay.
Well, I got stopped once and going to school a half hour early, right in North Canton. There was a highway patrolman that would sit out there all the time, and I never was late getting to school. And it was right at the edge of town. 5 of us got stopped. The other people were all going to church, and I was going to school. We all got stopped and got warned. I didn't get stopped anymore. He would they were letting people all the time out there fishing, and everything. They'd let them in the house. Aunt Lauren and Aunt Pearl were both gone. One was in one was in a nursing home. They both were by that time. Anyway, he had all these guns. And, in this one cupboard, in this one room, and living there alone, and there on this. And there was a neighbor man that told my mother, "You ought to get those guns out of there because you don't want anyone to steal those." So then we loaded them all up and took them to my mother's house. And then he knew they were gone, though. And he would call my mother up. And, when he'd call her up, he'd play these old records. These old records, still have the records. But she said she'd be on the phone and here Bert would be calling her up. But he knew that Mother had the guns. I think she eventually did take them back, I think. We never got the guns. I think she took them back because he was fussing so about them. So I think they were stolen in the end.
He sold all the hand-painted china to somebody for almost no money.
Yeah.
And then you discovered all those Canadian bearer bonds that he had.
Oh, yeah.
They were just there, and you were worried that
I got the bonds.
Somebody would just take them because there were bearer bonds. Right. Anybody could cash them in.
Yeah, he got those. But then I had the bonds to the SIO bank. And they were 1,000 bonds or something. Well, I took him to Caddis one time to the bank. I didn't talk to any of the bankers there. He went in, and then because the car he had in his garage was all moldy. No one had been in it for years. But anyway, then some way or other, I think Aunt Laura and them knew that he had money in the SIO bank, so they told me to go down there and find out. So then I would get they knew me. I wasn't being dishonest. I'd sought in that town and everything. So they would cash the bonds. Then I could give them to him, and he could use them to buy stuff. There was a Y camp, we went to Y camp at that one, and there was a Boy Scout camp out of Steubenville, Ohio. Well, they all knew him. And so the man that ran the man that was in charge of the Boy Scout camp, he would go buy him things if he wanted him to, and he would give him money. Okay. But He had these old things. I'd forgotten about those crazy old bonds. I think maybe we sent one of them to you in Massachusetts one time to find out if you, and they had to go through Canada or something to get out. He would buy stuff that he really shouldn't have bought, you know.
Yeah.
But there wasn't anyone to tell him not to buy.